Right, that's the next item on the agenda, as we say. Nigeria's rising debt profile, be it foreign or local. Well, a number of conversations revolve around that one. Why do we have to borrow if we can produce? Are we producing? Why are we not producing? And then in the face of that, you also have the Naira-dollar rate that's also not very comfortable for many Nigerians at the moment. Why is that? And what's all of that got to do with that World Bank IDA concentration risk report? That's all, and so many other things we're looking at this morning. But right here in Lagos, Kola Ayeye joins us. He is an economist as well as CEO, GDL Asset Management Limited. Thank you for joining us again this morning.
Thanks for having me.
Well, so on the one hand is that public or popular notion that the World Bank has declared Nigeria a high debt risk nation. And then there are, of course, the response of the DMO that no, Nigeria is not a high debt risk nation, or maybe we don't even understand what the World Bank said by that statement. What do you make of all of that?
Thank you, Ayo. I think that we now have a situation where debt service is almost 100% of federal government revenue. That means that the federal government is spending almost its entire revenue on debt service.
Debt service, not debt repayment.
No, debt service will include both interest and both principal and interest.
Substantive, okay.
By the time you're spending almost 95 kobo or more out of every 1 naira you earn to service debt, it is not sustainable. It's not sustainable.
But that's not what the federal government is saying. Federal government says it is sustainable. The DMO says it's sustainable.
Well, you know, we must be careful not to allow ourselves to walk into traps which do not fully reflect the totality of our situation. There are times when the ability to repay debt is related to population or to GDP. So people may say that our debt to GDP ratio is still within acceptable limits. But those assumptions, those principles are based on certain assumptions that at a certain level of GDP, government generates a certain amount of revenue. We are not generating that level of revenue. You don't pay back debt with GDP. You pay it with revenue. So if you are not generating sufficient revenue to pay debt, you will have a debt trap. You don't need to look far to project that if you keep it, not an individual, neither an individual nor a company nor a nation, there is no economic entity that can survive with a situation where over 90% of your income goes to debt service. So it will only be a question of time before we start having issues of default. It's, in fact, what has avoided default is that right now, rather than defaulting, central bank has accommodated the federal government by giving them overdraft, what is called ways and means. And those ways and means are beyond what, in my view, and what I think is a statutory limit. I think it says that government usually is supposed to borrow not more than 5% of its revenue in the previous year. So what I'm saying is that if the CBN wasn't accommodating the federal government, we'll already be in default. Ayo, if you use 90% of your revenue in channels to service debt, you will default in paying rent and in paying your children's school fees and in feeding. There will be a default. Or you will default in paying the debt. If a company is in the same situation, it will happen. It's not different from a nation. So I think it's better to say we have a problem and then look at how do we deal with it. But to say that we don't have a problem is not, I don't think that would be the best way to approach it.
But one of the, if you look at what we have on the screen now, yes, about Nigeria's external borrowing, it's risen so astronomically. Look at it. Yes. Between December 2015 and December 2020, yes, it's so astronomical. Between December 2010 and 2015, yes, look at what we have. I mean, yes, it's almost marginal, but what we have right now, it's so tremendous, so humongous, and looks quite scary.
Yes.
Now, but when you talk about the fact that government needs to pay back debt or service debt with revenue, the only thing how is government going to do that? Because the only thing that would that sounds like revenue as far as people are concerned are levies, taxes, licenses, and all those things, and it always comes from the people, whether as individuals or as businesses. If we're talking about businesses, the question you want to ask is, how well are the businesses themselves doing? So how is government going to get revenue with all of that?
Let me just step back a bit and say what was just displayed on the screen is worrisome. I want us to go back and remember that when there was a first oil crisis in the 80s, just after President, as a part of the course of President Shagari's tenure, we ran into the first debt crisis. And for 20 years, in fact, not for 20 years, for almost 30 years, from the early 80s until somewhere into President Obasanjo's regime, we were in a debt crisis. We were not servicing our external debt. In fact, what used to happen is the government would just provide a certain amount for debt service every year, regardless of what we were owing. So it was being bunched. And we were not able to repay that debt until we ran into a season of oil windfall. And with President Obasanjo's management of the economy, he got some forgiveness, I think about 12 billion, and we paid $18 billion, and we paid it off. We were struggling for about 30 years to pay back $30 billion. We are back there. And we are back there at the time when we are now using over 90% of our revenues to service debt. People shouldn't think that we can't go back into that situation. In fact, we are we are there. This situation deserves the attention of everybody. The way to grow the economy is not to put us into a debt fix. Now, coming to what you've said, we're 200 million people and government wants to generate revenue. The first thing we need to accept is that also we're told that 100 million of those people are living below the poverty line. What is the tax potential of people who are living below the poverty line? Taxing the poor is regressive. You can't. So to all intents and purposes, half of that population is outside of the tax net because they are very, very poor. So you can't keep singing about the 200 million. That's the first point. The second point is, right now, our debt per capita was said to be 164,000. But with a high level of unemployment, how many Nigerians are actually working? I'm not sure we have more than 40 million Nigerians. I'm sure our dependency ratio cannot be less than 4. Maybe only 40 million Nigerians are earning income. So when you divide our debt, it's no longer 164,000. It's north of half a million. And in the context of our poverty, it is high. So I don't think we should contest it. What I am more worried about is that if we're in a situation where you're using over 90% of revenues to service debt, and we're still contesting, we don't want to face facts. We should face facts and say we have walked ourselves into a debt trap, and say, how do we walk ourselves out of it? The challenge of government is that this government wants to invest massively in infrastructure. And that is important. And that is good. Now, you must now also say, we want to invest in infrastructure and we don't have the revenue. How do we do it? Is the best way to do it to go into debt? No. That's where they miss it. Or that's why I think we can do it differently. I think the best thing to do is to find a way to position the economy for people who have the resources, both local and international.
So how do we do that? Because that's one of the things that if government is going to get revenue, we need to be able to produce.
Yes.
Right? So how do we do that? How do we position like that?
You see, the first thing to do is that it's a difficult position to be in, but it's not impossible. The first signal that Nigeria needs to send to the world is a signal of efficiency. Government Rather than starting to worry about capital expenditure and growth in a situation where you don't have income, the first thing to introduce is efficiency. If we're spending 3 trillion on human resources, it should be shown transparently that all ministries, departments, agencies, and state-owned enterprises have all their human resources on electronic payrolls, and the issues of ghost workers is off. That's one.
Okay.
The second is that when it comes to overheads, that we now know that we are in a bind and that we are cutting expenses. We should have a year where, when there was the pandemic and people were not going to work, we should be able to say that because people didn't come to work, the amount of money we incurred on overhead was much less. Then you go to, so first of all, let us cut waste. Let us cut inefficiency.
You've talked about this so many times before,
yes,
but it's definitely a never-ending conversation, Mr. Ayeye. But a very, very quick one on the ease of doing business in ramping up revenue that you talked about earlier. Talking about the systems that help people to be productive. What are the challenges that you see, and what can we do to mitigate?
You see, where we are at is that a conventional model is not working. So we need to rethink our path to productivity. Government can't afford to fund infrastructure. Its determination to fund infrastructure is what is putting us in this debt trap. The large blocks of infrastructure that we need, rail, power, even further reform of the ports, we should put them in under new frameworks where the execution of these projects will be by the private sector. You see, all of these projects that we want to do, it is not bad to do it. What is important is that it gets done, and it gets done efficiently. Let's create a framework where the private sector does these things. You know, when the private sector does it, what we are looking for will not be debt. It will be investment. That is what is important, and that is what is that is what we need to do. We need to create a framework where the major investments in infrastructure is private sector led. One last thing. One of the things that government should then ensure, I don't know whether you've seen, for example, I have not seen, we spend a whole lot of money on rail, and it's good. I'm yet to run into a friend, a business person, whose business has been transformed significantly because he was engaged in the process of executing the rail project.
Well, it's quite, as I said earlier, it's definitely a never-ending conversation, and I'm pretty sure that as we sustain it, we'll take more views from you in due time. Kola Ayeye is an economist and CEO, GDL Asset Management Limited. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Good pleasure.
Well, your messages are part of our program, so let's begin with this one from Professor Inakena, who says, if we had power, we would have had industrial revolutionary growth, increase in exports, and this would widen the tax net. Also, we must invest in agriculture, decrease our interest on lending rates to single digits to grow the SMEs, and political will to cut recurrent expenditure.
Kimboyewa says, talking about insecurity in Nigeria, says the level of barbarism in our country is scary. Impunity has been allowed to reign because of no serious repercussions on these murderers. We're tired of press releases and arrests without prosecution and conviction. There must be increased security on our highways, and governments at all levels must wake up to their responsibility and do what they're supposed to do for our youths to stop them from turning to dangerous criminals.
Olagunju Oladele says about national security, hundreds of tribes exist in Nigeria. Almost all of them have scores of demands yet to be fulfilled by the government. Many have formed their organizations, indulging attacks against government forces and thus the insurgency. Many tribes are demanding their states and share of the national cake. It is human nature. The more he gets, the more he wants. The lack of equal experience is a problem to social relativity when a country has limited equal opportunities for everyone. Its people become very selfish and self-serving. Nigeria needs more advocacy on the Nigerian identity to enable tribal inclusiveness.
And Yomi Williams has this one. The continued news of carnage coming out from Plateau State is unnecessary and callous. The root cause of the protracted crisis has grown into different dimensions: religion, ethnicity, and farmer herders' activities. In all, the state government and the federal government should act more than they talk. Bloodbath is fast becoming our national identity, while we're all dealing with symptoms of crisis fatigue.
Aishat Waribebe says about the Plateau killings, there must be a holistic solution to the religious crisis in Plateau State before a lasting peace can be achieved. Plateau has been segmented into Christian and Muslim quarters about 25 years ago, and this has kept on fueling the crisis. Elders on both sides should sit down and dismantle this segmentation, proffer a holistic solution based on trust and justice, as in the past when Plateau State was tagged the most peaceful state in Nigeria.
Well, this one is from famous Demilehin, writing on the return of the Chibok girl. It says this matter should be taken seriously. Schoolgirls were kidnapped. Years later, the kidnappers are returning them as women with children as a result of rape, and no charges were brought against them. Are we really serious in fighting crime and their perpetrators? It's a big question.
Just before we go, ask a question. Is there a good time for doctors to go on strike? No, there is never a good time for doctors to go on strike. You know what? When doctors are not available to save lives, it's like a death sentence. And so there is no such a time that is good for doctors to be away from their duty posts. It is said that we have 72,000 registered medical doctors in Nigeria. Out of this number, only 35,000 are practicing. From that 35,000, 16,000 are resident doctors who have now gone on strike for 15 days and counting. The ratio of doctors to citizens in our country is 1 to more than 2,700 of the population of over 200 million people. 1 doctor to more than 2,700 people. The doctors' demands include better welfare and a fix to the healthcare system. These agitations didn't just start today. It's an age-long crisis that has led to deaths of Nigerians in their hundreds of thousands. There's an agreement by the African Union for 15% of the annual budget to go into healthcare. In this year's budget, only about 7% or less, is about 500 billion naira, was budgeted for health. Nigerian doctors leave Nigeria in droves, seeking greener pastures. The rich, the opportune, and the powerful have to fly out of the country to get medical attention. And the irony is, when they get there, sometimes they're attended to by Nigerian doctors practicing overseas, some of whom are reputed high flyers once they get abroad. A big question mark on the state of our healthcare. Some argue that it is morally incorrect for doctors to go on strike. But again, when they say government is a continuum, does that apply to government seeking its own side of the bargain in labor matters? The way and manner government handles labor relations must change. Sincerity is key here. As a matter of urgency, government must get into talks to save lives. Nigerians don't care who wins or whose ego is bruised. We just want a better country, and we hold government accountable. In the final analysis, it is imperative that government knows how to handle labor relations so we don't get into this sort of crisis again. It is shameful and it is needless. This doctor's strike must end. That's Sunrise Daily today. I'm Ayo Makinde.
Thank you for watching. I'm Maukwe Ogun Yusuf. Have a good day.